Welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. It's Halloween weekend, which means we're going to be covering two of the spookiest things out there. The undead and character assassination. That's right, we're talking about Sylvanas Windrunner. Warcraft has almost certainly never had a character, and quite possibly never will have a character, as controversial as Sylvanas. She is beloved by a huge slice of the community, and hated by just as many. Yet, strange as it may sound nowadays, this was not always the case. There was a time, a now far gone and mythical time, when the worst that most players felt about her was indifference. She always had her haters, of course, but they were more of a minority back then. It is obvious when exactly in the game's history this change really took hold, and we will touch on that, but there is much more to discuss here. There is a lot to her history that needs to be examined if we are to fully understand why she has wound up being the target of so many players' ire. Funnily enough, it'd be accurate to say that Sylvanas was a victim of her own success and popularity. I know many would contest this, but I have little doubt that at one point in time, she was the most popular Warcraft character. Yes, Arthas gets a ton of love, and so does Illidan. Thrall and Jaina are up there too as beloved mainstays, but Sylvanas had the benefit of both being an edgy character, like Arthas and Illidan, as well as having boobs, like Jaina. That's a cocktail for mass appeal that you can't really beat. As such, she's gathered a lot of love and a lot of attention, both from the development side and the player side. I have no doubt that dozens of writers have had their hand at shaping Sylvanas' story, though in this video, we'll be focusing on just 5. And for better or worse, each of those writers have had their own interpretations of the character and their own agendas when writing them. Of course, players also bring a massive range of interpretations to the table, fueled by the very variety the writers bring forth, and the inherently mysterious and shady nature of Sylvanas' personality. On one extreme, you have players espousing that she was always a purely selfish and evil character whose BFA presentation makes perfect sense. On the other extreme, you have a minority who sees her as a benevolent character focused on tearing down evil and protecting the vulnerable. And in the middle, you have people like me who see her as a somewhat selfish character who nevertheless looks after her own, be that either the more narrow body of the Forsaken or the larger body of the Horde. But circling back around, I wish to touch on who I consider the 5 most influential people in forging Sylvanas Windrunner's story. It is because she was written differently by different people that we wound up with the disjointed mess that we did, so it's important that we look at each of the major ones in turn. As a disclaimer, there will be a fair amount of speculation in this video. The writers are seldom given individual credit for what gets put out, so it can be hard to accurately pin a lot of this down. And of course, I am not a primary source. I'm probably not even a tertiary source. But I do have opinions and observations, and I want to share them. The person that we probably have to thank for Sylvanas' very creation is none other than Chris Metzen himself, the writer of both Warcraft 3 Reign of Chaos and the expansion set The Frozen Throne. Admittedly, in Reign of Chaos there isn't a ton to chew on. She's simply the main defender of Quel'Thalas for 3 missions that impedes your march as Arthas toward the Sunwell until you kill her in the 3rd and raise her as a Banshee. She is strong-willed and defiant, planting the seeds of her personality, and expects a clean death when she falls, but is denied it, planting the seeds of her coming arc. Where she is really developed is in the Frozen Throne. She has been forced to serve as one of Arthas' generals, but the instant his hold over her weakens due to Illidan damaging the Lich King, she immediately defies him. She attempts to kill him, but ultimately fails due to focusing too much on making him suffer instead of the main goal. Nevertheless, she and her Banshees break free and proceed to make their own place in the world. They ruthlessly take control of some ogres and bandits to bolster their ranks, and defeat the Dreadlord Varimathras, who pledges his loyalty to her to save his own life. They then proceed to take down the Nathrazim's brother, Deathrock, who had been mind-controlling the human Garithos. Garithos agrees to work with them to remove the final brother, Balnazar, from the capital city. After claiming victory, Sylvanas orders Varimathras to kill his brother himself, and then Garithos as well. As she then declares, "The capital city is ours, but we are no longer part of the Scourge. From here on out, we shall be known as the Forsaken. We will find our own path in this world, Dreadlord, and slaughter anyone who stands in our way." At this point, Sylvanas is established as a certifiable BAMF. She was at the lowest point imaginable, and through sheer tenacity and ruthlessness, managed to claw her way to freedom and to greatness. She had kinship with those truly loyal to her, but had no moral scruples about murdering those who were outside of her circle. And she was a hot zombie chick. Absolutely metal and easily my favorite Warcraft 3 character. Metzen did a great job of establishing her as likable and someone to root for. I should note, and this will keep cropping up, how Sylvanas manages to serve as an absolute icon of abuse victims and survivors, and how her story manages to be inspiring for those who have experienced such things. While wonderful that she manages to be a hero for so many fans, I'm actually inclined to think that this was incidental. Metzen's style of writing and much of early Warcraft writing is governed more by a rule of cool and sheer grit and awesomeness. It's easy to see how Sylv's story could have emerged through that alone, though perhaps it was his intent. Either way, it doesn't really matter, it was all wonderful. Although it's much harder to attribute writing credit to any one person as we move into World of Warcraft, I think that Metzen's impact was definitely strong at the start. The Forsaken joined the Horde and ostensibly bear no true loyalty to them? Perhaps so, at least initially, but they were comrades and they treated each other with respect at the very least. Sylvanas doesn't get much focus for a while, but is an obvious connecting point to bring the Blood Elves into the Horde in the Burning Crusade. She's far more prominent in Wrath, she and her Forsaken rocking into Northrend with a Fury and a target. They are again pretty dang metal and have even invented the Blight, a plague of sorts that even afflicts the undead. And they plan to use it to kill the Lich King, which goes hard and would be some real poetic justice. Of course, Putris's betrayal at the Wrathgate happens, killing many Alliance and Horde troops, and he and Varimathras stage a coup of the Undercity. Though nothing could be confirmed for sure at the time, it did seem like this genuinely took Sylvanas by surprise. And of course, she is present in the ICC dungeons where she tries to hunt down Arthas. She also features heavily in the Cataclysm revamp questing of Silverpine and Western Plaguelands, but I believe those zones can be more accurately credited to Cossack, so I'll touch on them later. Her role thereafter is relatively minor until Legion, when Vol'jin is killed off and names her as War Chief. I'll never think this was a good move. Basically nobody does. But at the very least, I do think Metzen and the other writers of the time were working on a certain angle for her. The Legion preview website had descriptions for many of the major characters, and Sylvanas's culminates with, as her fate edges closer to the abyss, Sylvanas must decide how far she'll go to protect her people, and whether they're more precious to her than her soul. Then we have Vol'jin's death cinematic, where she is clearly shocked by the mantle he is passing to her, with the words, "Many will not understand, but you must step out of the shadows and lead." The direction seemed clear. Sylvanas was going to have to rise to the challenge, and in doing so, realize that she cares more about the Horde than she herself believed, possibly making a great personal sacrifice in the future. Of course, she could always go the other way, but I fail to see how that would be remotely satisfying. We then proceed to get the Stormheim quests, where she dedicates her forces to retrieving the Aegis of Agramar to fight the Legion, while she individually went to make a deal with Helia for the Soul Cage, which she was going to use to make Aer raise more Valkyr for her. Still dubious and edgy, though arguably in the pursuit of ensuring the future of the Forsaken. And as we know, Metzen's last project before leaving Blizzard for a time was the Baal for Azeroth cinematic, one which very clearly leans into the vibe of Sylvanas acting more as a member of the Horde. You don't write that "for the Horde" scream, arguably the emotional high point of the whole thing, with the intent of it being a farce. And in Metzen's mind, it probably wasn't. He's gone on record saying that he was just as surprised as players to discover who burned Teldrassil. So that was a lot, but it's Metzen we're talking about here. I think it's pretty clear what he was going for with Sylvanas. She's edgy, dark, ruthless, badass, and a little bit mean. She comes across as self-interested and even believes herself that she is. But she's kinder than she realizes, and than many players realized. She wouldn't be the only vanilla leader that doesn't genuinely care about her people. And that's all she had to care about. Her people. The Forsaken. And possibly, over time, the Horde. I loved this Sylvanas, which should come as no surprise as it was the original, and it's probably my favorite depiction overall that we've been given. Next, I'd like to turn our attention to Christie Golden, who has a very long history of writing Warcraft novels as a freelancer, and who, for a few years, was officially brought onto the writing team for the game. She has gone on record saying that Sylvanas is one of her favorite characters, and as far as sheer quantity of prose goes, she's probably written more of Sylvanas than anyone else. Some of her works which prominently feature her are Arthas: Rise of the Lich King, War Crimes, Before the Storm, and Sylvanas. And at least of those I just listed, I've read all of them except for the Arthas novel. Because the majority of her contributions have been done as a freelancer, we can assume that she's had relatively little impact on any major decisions. Still, she certainly still had influence on how Sylvanas is portrayed within the framework of those decisions. I do believe that Golden has a deep appreciation for Sylvanas, though at the same time, I think she has a very different take on the character. Golden's writing, for better or worse, tends to feature thick moral commentary from the characters' thoughts and dialogue. Characters that you're meant to empathize with often wax poetic about the cruelty and injustices of the world, and characters that you're not meant to like are often very over-the-top evil. It's not that she isn't capable of nuance, but it feels like she doesn't want the reader to have to deal with it. And so, Sylvanas usually falls into one of those two camps, with the divide usually coming down to if she's alive or not. When it's Ranger General Sylvanas, she starts to feel a bit like other characters that Golden has an affinity for, such as Jaina. Of course, prior to Golden, we didn't have a lot to inform us of her personality while alive, but it almost feels like she's hesitant to really give her the coldness and ruthlessness that Sylv is known for. On the flip side, Banshee Queen Sylvanas is often shown to be overly callous and spiteful. This was especially true in Before the Storm, where she isn't really shown to actually care about the Forsaken's desires, and is almost operating a police state, as well as in the latter half of the Sylvanas novel, where she thinks about how the Forsaken and the Horde mean nothing to her outside of their usefulness. There is very seldom a middle ground in Golden's version. I will say that I feel Golden does exceptionally well at depicting Sylvanas and Varisa's relationship. Their dynamic is extremely enjoyable to me, and I'm always rooting for them to be happy sisters again, even if that may require Varisa to have to die for the cause. And Golden is probably my second favorite writer when it comes to scenes between Sylvanas and Nathanos. She really sells them having a deep, loving relationship that isn't bogged down with the pleasantries and flowery language that most Azeroth couples partake in. They're snarky to each other, but understand one another and know they can depend on each other. However, on the whole, Golden's Sylvanas is a very black or white one. I don't hate it, and it's clear there is love, but I personally wind up wishing for her Ranger General Sylvanas to have more edge, and that her Banshee Queen Sylvanas had more softness. Next up, we have Dave Kosak, whose concrete contributions are much smaller. However, the one short story he's credited for, Edge of Night, was a very pivotal one in Sylvanas' overall arc, and thus very much worth examining. Again, just because he wrote the words doesn't mean he was making the unilateral decisions about her, but still. Edge of Night occurs between Wrath and Kata, and has us join Sylvanas atop Icecrown Citadel, where she examines the aftermath of the raid. She is pissed that not only did she miss the final confrontation against Arthas and the chance to kill him herself, but that they had decided that someone else should take his place. Seeing no other purpose for her continued existence and feeling largely numb, she throws herself from atop the citadel to impale herself on one of its Saronite spikes, hoping that that would be enough to end her being and bring her peace. She is watched over by the 9 Valkyr, who proceed to show her visions of her life, followed by a vision of Lordaeron and Garrosh using the Forsaken as mere fodder to further his war campaign against Gilneas, not caring and in fact hoping that many of them should fall in the process. She also gets a glimpse of what truly awaited her in the afterlife, an eternity of suffering. Fueled by those two motivations, she ultimately agrees to the arrangement offered to her by the Valkyr. They bind themselves to her, thus freeing themselves of the binds shackling them to the dormant Lich King. In exchange, the leader of the Valkyr, Anhilda, sacrifices herself to revive Sylvanas. The other 8 can also be used to revive her, though as they are less powerful, 3 would be needed for future revivals, as seen with the Godfrey incident. Additionally, they provide her with a new source of necromancy, allowing the Forsaken to replenish their previously finite numbers. Edge of Night is important for several reasons. Firstly, it establishes Sylvanas' motivations going forward, as previously she was heavily focused on her vengeance against Arthas. Now though, she has two separate things to keep her going: defending the Forsaken against the fools of the world who would see them wasted, and to avoid the ultimate damnation that awaited her should she truly die. This was actually a great setup because it helped keep Sylvanas in a somewhat ambiguous state for players. Those who wanted to see the worst in her could point to her merely using others to avoid her fate. Those who wanted to see the best in her could point to her renewed passion in making sure the Forsaken are protected and flourish. And it helped establish what could eventually become a very important decision for her. Remember, the Legion preview site literally posited the question of whether protecting her people or her own soul was more important to her. Edge of Night also gave us two important quotes that the community would continue to parade around for years. Those referring to her people first as arrows in her quiver, and later as a bulwark against the infinite. And oh boy, all I'll say is that both her fans and her haters love to use and often contort those quotes to suit their own arguments. I also often see Sylvanas haters online claim that her story should have ended after Wrath, and that she should have died on those spikes. And look, I don't really mind all that much if you hate Sylvanas. There are characters I hate too, but, and forgive my bluntness here, that is the dumbest take someone could possibly have. First, that would be a massive waste of a compelling character. But more importantly, it'd basically be saying that an abuse victim has no purpose in the world once their abuser is out of the picture. And that's about the most effed up message you could possibly give. No, Sylvanas needed to keep going. She needed to find new meaning in her life, to heal, grow, and become so much more than just Arthas' victim. Now, I've heard that Cossack was also responsible for the writing of the Forsaken Zones in Cataclysm, which would make sense given how they tie in with Edge of Night. I couldn't find confirmation of this, only of him working on Ajara and the Southern Barrens, though I'm sure he did more. So while I am going to talk about them here, take their accreditation with an extra grain of salt. In Silverpine, she's shown to be maliciously compliant to Garrosh's orders. She carries out the war effort he has ordered, but isn't afraid to give him some snark, and straight up lies to him about ceasing use of the Blight. She attacks Gilneas and inadvertently kills Gen's son, though is ultimately blindsided by the betrayal of Godfrey. In Western Plaguelands, she personally gets involved in the taking of Anderhall, and afterwards has Koltira dragged into the Undercity to punish him for corroborating with Thessarian and the Alliance. So basically, we're getting more of her being edgy and legitimately morally gray. She does some questionable stuff, but it's always possible to justify it as doing what's best for the Forsaken or for the Horde. Overall, I'd say Cossack hovered closer to Metzen's vision for her than Golden's. But whereas Metzen made you feel like Sylvanas was your edgy friend who dresses in black and plays an electric guitar too loud to piss off her parents, Cossack seemed more interested in playing up the ambiguity and baiting discussion from the community. And now we move on to the writer who is the most problematic and the greatest outlier, Alex Afrasiabi. Now, he had been credited as creative director since Warlords of Draenor, but Sylvanas was absent for that and only involved in about a third of one zone for Legion. She would be much more prominent at the forefront of Battle for Azeroth. And now, Metzen was no longer around to oversee things and possibly rein in Afrasiabi's more off-the-cuff tendencies. I think it's clear that the man's main concern was generating hype and controversy to drive engagement and not necessarily having a plan or caring a great deal about what makes sense. In regards to Sylvanas specifically, he clearly leaned hard into depicting her as a sneaky, scheming villain. Some people attest that it was out of some sort of revenge for how Garrosh, a character he was fond of, was handled, but that's getting even more speculative than the rest of this video. At any rate, Afrasiabi clearly tried shoving Sylvanas in the direction of evil, holding back only just enough to keep people debating and speculating about how she might not be those things, how her actions could have some secret motivation that he clearly never figured out himself. For starters, we had the whole War of Thorns, which while not entirely awful, wasn't the best set up military campaign. Instead of a more natural trigger, it relied on Sylvanas convincing Sourfang that war was inevitable, so they may as well claim the first strike. Robert Brooks honestly did a pretty dang good job of selling it in the A Good War novella, but it was still rather out of nowhere and really shifts a lot of the blame onto her. Of course, we have the big one, the burning of Teldrassil, which, has extremely overt parallels to the invasion of Quel'Thalas. Delarin's Summermoon serves as the analog for Sylvanas herself, and Sylvanas serves as the analog for Arthas. Now, nobody is denying that Sylvanas is a shady and calculating individual, but come on. Remember that, incidental or intentional, Sylvanas is an icon of abuse victims. Now, obviously, victims can become abusive themselves, especially if they don't have positive role models to offset what they've learned, but the idea that they're likely to is a stereotype at best and downright offensive at worst. The fact that this message was pushed forward by the guy who would be outed as the chief sexual harassment guy at Blizzard is all the more damning, and makes it all the more infuriating that we can't just walk all of this back. Regardless of why he wrote Sylvanas this way, he ultimately did, and proceeded to pile more and more on. Though theoretically justifiable given that the city was infested with Alliance forces at the time, she did make the decision to blight the Undercity, a decision which the game made sure to portray as dastardly, given that Horde soldiers were caught up in it all. She was also, apparently, trying to make deals with the Sanlean, raised Derek Proudmoore and attempted to brainwash him to assassinate Jaina or Catherine, and following Derek's rescue, proceeded to execute Zelling and imprison Bane Bloodhoof. All this leading up to a second siege of Orgrimmar, where she declares that the Horde is nothing, and blasts Sourfang with death magic before wisping away. And look, some of those could easily be justified, but not all of them. And when taken as a whole, it very much paints a picture of Sylvanas growing more unhinged and more evil. Heck, Afrasiabi even went so far as to state that Sylvanas planned the Wrathgate incident, which feels less like a clarification of past events and more like a convenient retcon that helped serve his agenda. Regardless of how you may personally feel about Sylvanas, I think Afrasiabi's depiction of her was an exception to the norm. Even if you always thought her conniving and selfish, she at least wasn't so in your face about it. He seemed to want to depict her as unilaterally evil, and the way I see it, no other one writer did even remotely as much damage to her character as he did. Lastly, we have Steve Denuser, the man who inherited Afrasiabi's mess after he had to be ejected for his misconduct. However, even before that point, Denuser had made significant contributions towards Sylvanas content with his short story, Dark Mirror. This took place just before Legion and covers how Nathanos came by his new body/model. Basically, his old one from Vanilla was wearing down too much, so Sylvanas had one of her Valkyr undergo a taxing ritual to replenish and reinforce him, though a sacrifice was necessary. A sacrifice similar in nature to the recipient. They wind up using Stefan Maris, Nathanos' younger cousin, who had looked up to him and worked on his farm during life, eventually becoming a knight of the Argent Crusade. Though Nathanos does not object to the process at all, he does find himself feeling some uncomfortable emotions. Pride in his cousin for achieving his dream, and shame over having to end that dream. The story also recounts Sylvanas locating Nathanos while he was still a thrall of the Scourge, and breaking him free of his mental shackles. Dark Mirror does much to establish the two's dynamic of sarcastic, often grumbling comments, and the tendency to provoke reactions out of one another, while also being incredibly devoted to one another and putting in great effort and sacrifice to keep one another around and fulfill each other's wishes. It's difficult to pinpoint where Afrasiabi's work ended and where Denuser and the rest of the team had to begin their efforts to salvage the story. Some would argue that he actually made the story worse, as they were completely fine with Sylvanas eating the villain bat, but hated the idea of her being redeemed in any way. What we wound up with was ultimately somewhat of a compromise, a conclusion to her story designed to satiate both her haters and her fans. Her behavior was explained with a soul split induced by her death at the hands of Frostmourne. The better half of her soul wound up in the jailer's possession, and the worst part went on to become the Banshee Queen. When the Banshee at last defies Zoval after he more overtly played his hand at being a subjugator, he returns the other half of her soul, sending her into a coma until she can reconcile the two halves. Uther aids her in this regard, with the good half having to accept the sins of her bad half. Though ultimately, we as players would be expected to give her some leeway, as operating with just the darker half of your soul would cause anyone to behave in ways they normally wouldn't. Sylvanas then helps us to free Anduin from his domination and to defeat Zoval, before submitting herself to Tyranda's punishment and being tasked with freeing every soul from the Maw. I would argue that Danusser and the team took the high road here. It had to be incredibly tempting to wash away all the baggage that Afrasiabi had left her with. Pin it all on the jailer dominating her mind or something. I'm sure many would have preferred that. But they recognized that many would see that as a cop-out and just giving one of his favorite characters a free pass. Instead, he contextualized her misdeeds without wiping them away. He made her face punishment without going so far as to kill her off. He may not have given most players what they wanted, but he made sure nobody got their worst possible ending. And I have to applaud him for his willingness to go for such a balanced, good faith conclusion. At the same time though, I hate it and wish he'd picked Elaine. Sorry. Admittedly, I don't really know how you go back from BFA Sylvanas without some sort of cop-out that makes it all feel like terrible writing, but I don't feel like what we got wasn't still incredibly unsatisfying. And my main gripe boils down to one oft-overlooked element of what we were given. In his efforts to neither absolve nor kill off Sylvanas, Danusser ultimately did kill her off. By making all of Sylvanas' actions since being raised by Arthas until the end of Sanctum of Domination the actions of just her darker side, and then reunifying the halves of her soul, he essentially made all of those the actions of a character that now no longer exists. The character that we interact with in patch 9.2 is someone that we last saw in Reign of Chaos for all of 3 missions. Whether consciously or subconsciously, most players seem to have bought into it all. But the way I see it, the Sylvanas that I was invested in has ceased to exist. The fact that we have this replacement walking around and being passed off as the same thing, even if she was the original, almost feels like a mockery of that character. That isn't to say that the plot point of a fragmented soul cannot work. I think it was handled very well in Uther's case, because his dark side, as it were, was not that dissonant from his complete self, and we only really dealt with the dark Uther fragment for half an expansion, compared to Sylvanas, who we had interacted with for 19 years, and was, by the end of it all, extremely dissonant from her complete self. Ultimately, I do think Danusser is a good writer. He's my favorite when it comes to writing Sylvanas and Nathanos stuff, and I think he's pretty good at more self-contained stories like Dragonflight. I wish we could have gotten a novel from him at some point. I think, when it comes to Sylvanas, he simply got overwhelmed with the tremendous weight of the ship he had to correct. One side of the fanbase was goading him towards Scylla, the other urged him toward Charybdis. Ultimately, he split the difference and drove the Titanic into an iceberg. So those are our 5 main puppeteers who controlled the marionette that is Sylvanas Windrunner. Metzen, who created her character as this rebellious champion you were supposed to root for. Afrasiabi, who spun her as a scheming villain you were supposed to hate. Golden, who had a penchant for making her black and white. That is very moral while alive and very immoral while undead. Cossack, who instead aimed for an ambiguous gray morality. And Danusser, who tried to avoid making anyone too upset and as a result hardly made anyone happy. And of course, there were many other writers who had their own opportunities to use the character in less pronounced ways. Personally, I think I'll always prefer the original Metzen Sylvanas, though I thoroughly enjoyed anything that felt similar enough, such as what Cossack gave us in Edge of Night and what Danusser gave us in Dark Mirror. There is an obvious meta-narrative irony to having the central theme of a fictional character be free will. At the end of the day, no such character has ever truly had it. They are all beholden to the whims and desires of those putting pen to paper. Still, I think we can agree it's been done better elsewhere, and it comes down to simple believability. If we as an audience can be fooled into believing that what we're watching is a cohesive, consistent character, we can buy into their story. But Sylvanas has been yanked around so violently over the years to serve the wants and needs of her writers that she stopped feeling real. She has been used, objectified. It's a sad echo of what happened to her in the story itself. She's hardly the only character to meet such a fate. Jaina Proudmoore felt like a bit of a yo-yo between the bombing of Theramore and the Bane rescue scenario. But Sylvanas is perhaps the most pronounced example, particularly with how she was treated in BFA and Shadowlands. Her handling should be taken as a cautionary tale of what can happen when you don't have a consistent figure around the writing room to pump the brakes. Sadly, it is also rather meta-narratively fitting that Sylvanas, a character respected and admired by her people, and who in many cases came to be scorned for her actions that she was forced by someone else to undertake, would face a similar fate in real life. She was one of Warcraft's most adored characters. Yet, because her actions were contorted by powers she never had a chance of defying, she has become, to many, its most reviled. Granted, literally every character is judged by the actions their writers force them to undertake. I guess what's ultimately so frustrating in this case is that the strings are just so visible. For this week's drawing, I obviously went with Sylvanas, who, as I've stated before, was my favorite character from Warcraft 3, and who is still, like, my third favorite character overall. And of the 4 Warcraft 3 factions, the Horde was my favorite there. So when WoW combined my favorite faction with my favorite character, it was the biggest no-brainer in history. So unshockingly, I was a little bit perturbed by what happened to her during BFA and Shadowlands, which you may have picked up on if you've watched almost any of my videos ever. And the reasons for liking her are obvious. She's edgy, she's snarky, she's resilient. And yeah, it certainly doesn't hurt that she's a sexy zombie lady. I certainly had a plethora of options for what model and armor I could have chosen to draw her in, but for me, the most definitive look has always been the one she gained in Wrath of the Lich King and kept up until Legion. The dark purple armor with those cool tassels. And she seems to have had 2 prominent bow models in her history. One is the very bony looking one, but ultimately I decided to go with Ray Shalare, the legendary one that can drop from her Sanctum of Domination encounter. And I opted to depict her in the Undercity. I feel like in more recent years, her connection to the Forsaken specifically has almost been forgotten. It's been more about how she relates to cosmic forces, or Anduin, or Thalassian elves. But let's not forget, she founded the Forsaken and was their leader for a heck of a long time. And it's this version of Sylvanas that I prefer to remember. So thank you for watching, and I will catch you next week. Bye-bye.